Welcome to Danny's Podcast.
This is the Redefining Plastics Podcast. Justin Lane. Today I've got a special one. I think you may have heard me on his podcast, was it 2 weeks ago maybe? But we've got that plastics guy, Kurt Stahle. I saw Kurt through LinkedIn, which once again, the powerful tool that LinkedIn is, connecting us together. And I loved what he was doing. And so I wanted to bring him on here and introduce him to my audience. And we did the same on his. So Kurt, thanks so much for joining, and I really appreciate you being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it, and I love what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a mutual affection, I guess we could say. So once again, this is going to be a little different than my typical episode. Most of my episodes have been on recycling and more on that side of the equation, but really wanted to talk to some more industry professionals, some veterans, if you will, some people that have been around, they've been in the trenches, they've been in the battles, and you've got a ton of experience in plastics. You've seen it all. And so I really wanted for you to give the audience just a bit of your background, how you got into this, and what you do today.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think like a lot of people in our industry, not everyone, a lot, I came to it through a family member. My father owned an injection molding company in my hometown, Kitchener, Ontario, which is about 60 miles west of Toronto in Ontario. And I started working there the summer I turned 16, which was 1986.
You don't need to go into years. You can leave that part out.
So, well, I only say that because I'm almost at 40 years in the industry. And I worked there as a machine operator during the summer to pay for, car insurance and all the sort of dumb things guys do at that age, not being too forward looking, but living in the moment. So that was great, but I liked the industry. And after summer, I still worked there during high school, typically work 30, 32 hours a week, like 4 or 5 hours a night, then the full shift on Friday afternoons. And I did some materials handling and production management at a relatively combined scale, but, I was doing it. And then towards the end of high school, before I went to university, I got into doing mold changes and basic machine maintenance. And, these were old angles, so they always marked the territory, and you had to top up oil and contain spills and messes. I mean, we're talking equipment of a certain vintage here. Not like the modern stuff. These were definitely old school, but it was a great learning ground. And, it just taught me roll up my sleeves, get your hands dirty, and learn. But even from that age, the one thing that really stuck with me and I think kept me in the industry was this profound curiosity for how everything is made. And then, of course, with that, it's like, who are taking these hundreds of thousands of widgets and whatever? Where is all this going? Like, it's kind of mind-boggling. For the longest time, we had the contract to make Bondo spreaders, the auto body filler stuff. And we would send pallets and pallets of these Bondo spreaders to, I think it was Dynatron Bondo in Atlanta, Georgia, if memory serves. This is going back a while, but, you just really start asking yourself, where is all this stuff going? So that was one side of it. The other side, like I said, just this profound curiosity for how things were made. And that stayed with me. My father ended up closing his business, but after a short time out of the industry, selling materials handling equipment and always staying close to industry, I got back into it, but selling resins, and that was through A. Schulman Canada. They were a very large supplier of ours when we were doing molded parts for Noma. And I assume that's a brand that's fairly well known in the U.S. I think it was a Canadian brand originally, but we molded product for them for years and years. And, the Schulman stuff would come in. What's a Schulman? Well, I found I had 12 years of, selling their compounded distribution product, mostly automotive. And I'd say 10 out of my 12 years were very intense on the automotive side. Towards the end of it, I was the last sales rep across Canada for Schulman. I dealt with all of the automotive tier ones. There really wasn't any OEM action in Canada to speak of, and we had another crew of people in Birmingham, Michigan, dealing with that side of it. But I managed all of the tier one accounts, so the Magnas and Flexing Gates and ABC, like the heavy hitters. When Schulman closed the first time around in 2010, I was practically relieved because I was sort of at the stage of burnout. It was a lot of business volume to manage. And then, within a year, I had bought Simcoe Plastics, and I've been carrying on with that since, and very careful about how much automotive I have in my portfolio, but it's still there. I mean, you really can't turn that kind of business down.
So now you're distributing pretty much full time, right? Like you're buying and selling.
That's it. Over the years, the business model has changed a little bit, but it's still essentially distribution. But rather than buying through a main distributor and reselling their product, I also have direct supplier relationships. Like I owned a color compounding business for about 3.5 years, which unfortunately didn't survive the pandemic. But I moved as much of that business as I could to another Toronto-based supplier and have had a great relationship with them. So, it's almost like acting like a manufacturer's rep, but I'm doing a buy and sell, but having a lot more involvement in the creation of the products, which I really like. I import multiple products from the US, a very slick mold release alternative. I get into doing some nylons and other things, and that's where the automotive business lies.
I don't want to get too much into the politics, but these tariffs are spooking a heck of a lot of people, right? It's that's all I see anymore. LinkedIn is just you tariff us, we're going to tariff you. You're not going to get any syrup. You're not going to have any of this. You're not going to have any of that. And it's like, come on, guys. It's all posturing. That's all this is. Just
It's terrifying.
Yeah, it is. Because we've had what, NAFTA, and now it's whatever, the U.S. free trade or whatever the heck that one's called.
Right.
But we've become so accustomed to free trade in North America that you'd almost have to, for big corporations like the one that I work for, you almost have to hire somebody specifically to handle the implications of that, because there's a lot of stuff moving between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and it would cause a lot of problems.
You're not kidding. Well, before free trade, we had the Auto Pact between U.S. and Canada. And then, that gave way to the original free trade agreement, which, geez, it's been in place so long, I can't even remember how long, like late 80s, maybe. I can't even remember. It's just this thing you sort of take as a given. But at the time we're recording this, Feb 4th, for the past several days, I've been working with customers and suppliers. We're trying to figure out what may happen, but no one really knows.
No.
And, yesterday was a lot of time spent with my customs broker time. I wish I would have been out selling, but, you've got to deal with this. And see, I don't have anyone else here. It's me. So, I get to deal with it.
So are you running that business all on your own, or do you actually have employees there?
So in terms of the operational stuff, yes, it is me. I have a sales rep in the west coast of Canada, British Columbia, and I have a part-time office administrator who has done an amazing job getting my website revamped, creating revitalizing the digital marketing collateral and several other things. But all the operational stuff, it's me.
Yeah. That takes family business to a whole new meaning. Family of one. It's you out there on an island. But so the company is Simcoe Plastics.
Correct.
How did that come about? How did you, because that existed before you got involved with it, correct?
Yeah, right.
You want to give a little backstory on the company itself?
Sure. Simcoe Plastics was founded by a fellow named Bill Wheeler in 1980. And Bill was a sailor, just like I am. And that'll sort of tie in a moment. And the company was named after Lake Simcoe in the Barrie area. It's about 60 miles north of Toronto, and that's where I happen to live. But Bill was an avid sailor, and he started sailing on Lake Simcoe in about 1969 or 70. And when it was time for him to go on his own, his kids told him, why don't you call the company Simcoe Plastics? You love Lake Simcoe. Okay, fine. So that was the name of the company, and Bill was into trading and doing some reselling work. not distribution in the sense that I've taken it into, but certainly, the buying and selling and dealing more so in scrap plastics, recycling, reprocessing, when there was probably, I think safe to say, a bigger arena to play in for that.
Before it was cool, right?
Before it was cool. Yeah. For those of us who knew where to go and make some money and do the right thing with this valuable commodity that we. So fast forward a number of years up till about, I guess, 2008, 2009. Bill wanted to retire, but if you recall, there was this little financial crisis that the world was gripped in, and he couldn't sell his company to anybody. Now, if you recall, I also said he was a sailor, and my uncle, also a sailor, the two of them were at the same marina, sailing the same style of boat, and they were a few slips down the dock from each other. So they met at a marina Christmas party, and Bill was complaining about not having anybody to sell the business to. And my uncle said, my nephew should buy that business. He's been in the industry for so many years. I think it would be a great fit.
Did he get a finder's fee on that deal at all, or?
He should. So literally the next day, he called me, said, you got to talk to Bill. He's selling his business. So I know Bill. I'm at an industry function, or at least one, if not two. I was aware of the business and aware of the fact that, he had a good reputation and had done a lot of good things. So I called him right away, and he was quite happy to hear from me. I had lunch with him the next day, and we pretty much had it put to bed within a few days.
I'm pretty sure quite happy was an understatement. If he'd been struggling to sell a business, he was probably doing cartwheels in the parking lot.
Yeah. And it wasn't, I didn't pay an exorbitant amount of money for the business. But I guess if you look at the value proposition of buying something like that, not too many people would be a good fit for it. So I was a good fit, and I could have burned through a lot more cash starting up these supply relationships and building a customer base. I could have burned through a lot more cash during that process than if I just bought somebody's essentially book of business. Yeah. And, all the suppliers were supportive. They honored terms. The customers were happy to see someone take over. And the sales rep that was with the business, he agreed to come with me and help me out for a few years, which he did. This Bill, I have so many fond memories. And every day was a chemistry lesson because he was a chemical engineer, and some account lessons and, business history of Simcoe Plastics lessons. So there was just this great carryover process from, old to new.
Yeah, I think the M&A process, it's always a little complicated, right? I've been involved on the buy side at multiple large organizations and taking one culture and putting it into another. But the lessons that you learn from some of the folks in those organizations that have been doing things differently their whole career. And I think the one thing that big corporations miss out on is they want to put their culture in. It's like, we're bringing our culture. It's successful. We're going to do it. And they miss out on a lot of that knowledge base that's there because they shut people down way too early. But that's an aside. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
I agree with you. And I experienced it firsthand when Schulman went through, I guess they were trying to have a bit of a renaissance. And this was shortly before they shut their Canadian operations. They had a management team from Germany come over to run North America.
That's always good.
Yeah. It's, I respect
just different cultures, right? And nothing against Germans in general. It's just the way they do business is wholly separate to the way that Canadians, U.S., Mexico do business. And never the two shall meet. They're so different.
That was about 60% of it. The other 40%, the product mix that Germany specialized in, compounded nylons and engineered resins. Like Schulman was sort of on the same level as a DuPont. Like they were leaders of technology. And in North America, the nylon product range, it was very good, but it wasn't what I would consider to be something that was outstanding, or we weren't regarded in the same level as a Bayer or a DuPont or a Dow or anything like that. So they sort of came in with certain expectations of how the market would receive their approach, and it didn't work. It was not successful, not for want of trying, and it did leave with some good things, left in terms of how we approach the market and what we do, but it was overall a mess. So
Yeah.
win some, lose some.
Yeah. So you got out of there before the Lyondell-Basell and all of that stuff too.
Yeah. I did keep in touch with several folks who worked for the company that I was close to, and every day it was just under soap opera. It was so unfortunate.
Oh, I don't know anything about any of that. I know some people that were on both sides of that, but I don't know any of the pertinent details. So I stayed the heck away from that one. But I've heard rumblings that it was less than desirable. But
it was basically 2 exits from Canada with different corporate headings. You're right.
So you've been there now since 2009, or was it actually in 2008, right at the height of
so I was
crisis
at Schulman up until the summer of 2010.
Okay.
And Simcoe Plastics, I ended up, officially taking over. It was June 1st, 2011. We're coming up on 14 years having the business.
It's incredible. Whenever there's small success stories like that, I love that. Is for you to be successful selling resin against all of these deep pocket players. Because if you look at distribution right now, you got Ravago and you got Ravago and you got Ravago and then you got Ravago. You really don't have anybody else that is in there, which I know the purpose of this conversation is not to critique the distribution networks of plastics, but I'm not entirely sure how all of that has slipped under the radar with trade commissions here in the U.S. or the SEC. But that's a completely different discussion. But yeah, so you're fighting against a lot of really big, deep pocket players, and you're successful. And I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're successful because of relationships, right? And service and making sure that you do what you say you're going to do and doing things better than the big bureaucracy of these big companies would do for people.
I mean, I'll be very upfront. I am not perfect. I'm not batting 1,000 every time I go out.
Nobody is. Yeah.
I do better on average than most. And you're right. You mentioned the word bureaucracy, and that's the biggest issue that I hear dealing with other accounts. The people I call on, they don't want to be thought of as just a number. They want somebody they can call. They want, they want some flexibility and understanding sometimes in payment terms. Not that I can afford, I'm not a bank, I sell resin.
Yeah.
Kurt's lending and finance.
Well, hey, maybe that's your second calling after plastics.
But it really is, working with other business owners. That's my sweet spot. Other small to medium sized players, and understanding what they're going through because I've lived it. And if they're a little short, they're a little tight, I work with them. Don't abuse me, but if you need some help periodically, I'll do. And being as responsive as I possibly can. I've heard enough from, again, talking to customers about these larger companies, and some of the hires that they make are quite questionable. There's just not the same sort of dedication that someone like me might have, and it happens. And then you get guys who are in the distribution game, corporate folks that are absolutely awesome. And the only thing letting them down is potentially, not having supply, or maybe their price is a little bit off. When you're dealing with mega millions of dollars of inventory, you'd think there's more of a propensity to turn it. And by and large, yes, but not all the time. So I could squeeze in and sometimes get those opportunistic sales, but they could do that to me too.
Yeah, I think I'm always amazed when I see small companies that are successful in a big company world, because there's been a lot of, we'll call it consolidation in the plastics industry, and not just distribution. We're talking big players in packaging. So Amcor, Berry, Novalex Pactive, really the plastics industry is changing pretty rapidly right now. And the landscape is going to look a lot different over the next 6 months than it did just recently. And it's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out. But I'm interested. The one thing that I ask every single person that comes on my podcast, and I'm going to ask you, what do you think of when you hear the word plastic?
Well, in my totally unbiased view, I look at it and think about it as this wonderful commodity that's been tailor-made to basically be at our beck and call for just about anything we can imagine. And yet, on the other hand, and I sort of alluded to this at the top of the conversation, where I just observed, all these pallets of products and where's all this going? The other part of me is like, well, okay, we have to be responsible for this stuff. I think it's incumbent on us first, or we can have a high degree of influence. And how do we manage this thing from cradle to grave? And that's been a mindset of mine for an awfully long time. And as a small player, I don't know how best to attack and approach that. So yes, it's an amazing commodity. That's what I think of first. And secondly, how do we manage this amazing commodity so we get the most out of it? Not allow it to go in places where it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's really fair. And I struggle quite a bit. So my LinkedIn is kind of taking off recently, and mainly because I got involved in these kind of discussions that I never would have been in before, which I really enjoy. And there are a lot of people on my LinkedIn that are talking about how, let's just not worry about what happens to plastics after it's used because it's still better than the alternative. And, they have a point. But we need to worry about what happens to this stuff at the end. We need to make sure that we are doing our best to be good stewards of this material and making sure that we can reuse these things multiple times and then it doesn't end up in the environment. I think that's just a good thing to do, just not even from a business perspective, just from a human perspective. And I think that's where a lot of people in the discussion in my community gets a little off the rails, is there's a lack of empathy, I think, from some of the science forward people that are very much like, here's what's happening. This is what we should do. And they don't think about what 99.9% of North Americans, so Canadians and the US, would think about. And we got to think about all of these things because we're marketing this stuff, right? We want to sell our products. And if we lose trust with the consumer, everything's lost. I don't know if you have anything to add from that, but that ramble interrupted by my daughter screaming in the background, which we can edit out.
That's okay. It gave me a few moments to collect my thoughts. It's all good.
Yeah.
For guys like us that are involved on the selling end of it, that's one very unique set of skills. And having some experience in recycling, I was part of a business trying to recycle plastics from the healthcare sector. It is a radically different set of skills to corral recyclable materials, sort them, process them, get them to a stage where you could sell it, and then turn it back over to someone on the sales side. Say, okay, here's your product. Go run with it. Find the applications. Don't oversell the material. Go find a home for it. We were even working with another company close by that was into chemical recycling. So we would sell them some of what we were trying to make, and they could break it down into other industrial products. Yes, definitely a higher margin or they wouldn't be doing it. But it is a radically different skill set to deal with, we'll call it waste product, sort it, get it reprocessed. If we're talking densification, like I've been listening to your shows where you talk about EPS, if it's densification or if you're using, conventional twin screw or single screw to repelletize it, all of the nuances that go into those pieces of equipment, which I learned the hard way about as well. Man, oh man, it is not an easy thing to crack. And you can have all the equipment in the world, and I swear there's 10 times more product waiting to come into the equipment. So it can be a little overwhelming. But once you sort of let that feeling subside, and say, okay, we're going to focus on this, and we're going to create some plants that do this and nothing but else, just this, and get good at doing that. They can actually, I think, start to make some inroads and have some effective recycling.
This conversation's bringing this thought back to mind. Really thinking about doing like one of those masterclass type things and just talking about selling recycled material, because I learned the hard way what not to do. And not a lot of big companies really understand how to sell recycled content. So resin producers, because it's so different to anything that they do. You have to understand what questions to ask. I've got certain questions that I ask when I talk to every customer. What's driving this? Are you trying to meet an EPR law? Are you trying to meet a specific customer? Is it something that you're committed to? The other thing is, you and I both know, once the market turns and resin prices drop, first thing that they stop buying, recycled content material. Every time. So what's your commitment level? Is this something that you have to do to keep a customer or sell it into a state or country? Great, we'll do that. What color do you want? Because half the time they don't even realize that there are different colors in recycled material. So are we talking mixed color where I can make it into a black and a gray? Are we talking just black? Are we talking white? Are we talking natural? Completely different markets for each of those, different price points. And nobody understands this, and it frustrates the heck out of me. So for your business specifically, what are your biggest concerns in the short term? Let's call them hurdles or obstacles for the plastics industry for your business specifically.
So because I'm not a large-scale distributor, who shall remain nameless, we're not even going to ring them up. And I think this is probably indicative of any small business person who is selling a range of products. How do we get the brands that we want to represent signed up with us and have them say, yes, we know he's a smaller player. We're going to accept some smaller numbers, but he fulfills an important, spot in the market. So getting suppliers that bring credibility to me, that I could sell, get the pricing right, and everything is happy. That's a constant, that's just a constant issue. And I've done it sometimes much better, and other times, not quite so, but it's so good having those names associated with Simcoe Plastics. I've got a great line card now, but there are still spots that I want to fill to just keep the company relevant and have people, when they want color, well, we'll call Kurt. But what about resins? Well, he's got, these brands, we'll call him. So that certainly is always top of mind. I'd say second, this again applies to just about any business, regardless of the size. I heard it summed up as this: the primary focus of the president of a company is to ensure they never run out of cash. Because you need cash for operations, you need cash for inventory, you need cash to finance the spread between your receivables and payables. You've got to be able to draw some money yourself. I don't have much in the way of capital equipment, but every so many years, I lease another car for myself. Well, okay, I've got to make sure I've got cash flow for all of these things. I am going to be bringing on a sales rep this year and an office manager. So I need to ensure that I've got cash to pay for these people. And when do you hire an employee? When you need them? Well, no, it's a little bit before. So you've got to lay out some cash and have the business grow into it, based on your best guesstimates of things. So ensuring that I've got good financing. I have 2 rounds of financing that I was very fortunate to get last fall from BDC, which is the Business Development Bank of Canada. We're not talking the lowest interest rates, but it's a federal institution, Canadian government institution, and they have a mandate to support small business. So they will offer somewhat more favorable terms of granting financing, but it's not the cheapest. So that's fine. That's allowed me to do some things with inventory and increase my buying power to ensure I'm relevant on that side. And then, the short term now is trying to navigate what may or may not happen with tariffs. For many of us that follow politics closely and kind of have a sense of what Trump is all about. We know that he will put these, they're not idle threats, but it's a big one he puts on the table to get people's attention and draw them to the negotiating table like now. And if you look at what he's done, again, we're recording on February 4th. Just yesterday, he got the movement that he wanted from both the Mexican government and the Canadian government with respect to borders and specifically to stop fentanyl, which, I think these are things that should be happening. And I'm sure Mexico and Canada, they weren't doing zero prior to, but he's moved it up from the priority list.
Yeah.
And that's great. And he's deferred the tariffs for 30 days. But if those should go through, even a small percentage becomes a paperwork exercise, which is more hassle and burden. But if they're 25%, that's hugely detrimental to all countries involved. And, the fallout, it would be, almost instant, and it would be painful potentially for years. That's Rob being Sue's plate.
Not just you. I think everybody. Are you generally positive about the outlook for your business?
So it's interesting you say that. The last couple of years has been a real slugfest coming out of the pandemic. And I think the U.S. Treasury did exactly what the Bank of Canada rose interest rates very dramatically to put the brakes on inflation, and that put the brakes on orders. So it's really been a bare bones situation for, I'd say, the last 18, maybe 24 months. 2025 orders have come in at a pace I haven't seen for quite some time.
Good news.
Starting like January 2nd, things were coming in, and it's not slowing down. Even with, the tariff scare, it's not slowing down. So I'm feeling more optimistic about 2025 and sort of the path forward from everything pandemic, inflationary, and quantitative easing to quantitative tightening. And
all those fancy phrases that economists like to throw at us. Yeah.
So I feel better about the business now, more so than I have for probably a number of years.
Let's take that to the macro level. What about the plastics industry? The outlook for the plastics industry as a whole?
So I'm going to take that in sort of two directions. The plastics industry, like in its entirety, it's not going anywhere. With the push for EVs that way, I think people are just starting to really clue in to some of the disadvantages. Like the GM Hummer, not to pick on the Hummer, but that's 10,000 pounds with a maximum battery pack. A Tesla, I think you're looking at about 6,000 pounds. Like, these are heavy vehicles because of the battery. So we're going to need plastics, some pretty fancy stuff, more and more, to replace very heavy metal or, elaborate castings. Even if they're lightweight magnesium or other things, we could do more with maybe a carbon reinforced nylon 6/6 or, some of these more interesting engineering grades. So the industry as a whole, I have tremendous confidence in. It's not going away. And if you really get the people thinking about it, synthetic materials as a whole, they're responsible for giving us the life that we have now in terms of healthcare, in terms of food security. Like, food doesn't go bad very often. I mean, it arrives from, a producer or an abattoir, whatever the case, very well packaged, protected, and it gets to our homes well packaged and protected. We're not dealing with issues with food too often. And if you told someone like the yoga loving people that they can't have their yoga pants because they contain, basically all synthetic fibers, they'd be in a forever. But the industry is going to be just fine. It will always adjust. There are some tremendous minds, at work and R&D and trying to see where things are going to go and adjust the product offerings accordingly.
I do want to switch gears just a little bit. That plastics guy, where did that come from? How did that come about? I like the title, first and foremost. I've always liked the title. A little jealous of the title, actually. Where did this whole thing come from? Like, why are you doing it? Just give a little background on the podcast.
Sure. So in the fall of 2023, I started working with a group of consultants here in town in Barrie, Ontario, where the business is. And we agreed that they would help me, in essence, rebuild the company, not in terms of sales, that's my job, but they would help rebuild the infrastructure, help me design a path forward, help me define what the ideal target customers were, what products I should really be going after, given what I wanted to achieve, and better ways of marketing the business. And I think at that time when I came to them, again, coming out of the pandemic, and I had a number of deeply upsetting personal things happen, was married for close to 30 years, and my former wife died of cancer.
Sorry to hear that.
Thank you. I think I was sort of just so burnt out and frazzled. I knew I needed to do something, but I needed the support of somebody who was super keen on numbers, super keen on marketing, and then their background people who could kind of make it happen. So I started working with them, getting the infrastructure laid out, how I'm going to approach certain things, and their marketing experts said, well, why aren't you doing a podcast? I've known you for a bunch of years. You handle yourself very well. And I'm like, really? Seriously?
They had that right. Like, you communicate very well. You're very succinct, to the point. It makes sense.
Thank you. At the time I started the project, though, I think I was right in the right headspace for it.
I'm telling you, the first couple episodes that anybody does are going to suck. You're going to sit there and you're going to overthink it. You're not going to be yourself. You're going to think, well, I need to be like Joe Rogan because Joe Rogan's making millions. And then you start thinking, well, I'm in plastics. It's never going to happen. So why don't we just have fun with this whole thing?
Yeah. And I'm not even trying to be the Joe Rogan of plastics. That's
me either. That's ridiculous. But
I mean, I would love to have millions of viewers, and not going to happen. That's the trajectory. So they came to me with the idea of doing a podcast, and I was a little terrified of the idea, but I had a background in public speaking. So as a kid, and I always sort of, angrily shook my fist at my mother for making me take elocution lessons, they were called, and going on public TV at the time, like kids' talent shows, doing speeches and poetry and monologues. Well, didn't that just sort of prime me to do this? So it was a very interesting training decades before I would really apply it. Then came having to get my head around the technology side of it. And, they helped somewhat with that. But, you jump on YouTube and with a few minutes, you can get videos on just about anything. I went out and spent, probably a couple $1,000 on podcasting equipment, geeked out a little bit. That was Christmas 2023, and January 24, I started rolling out these, kind of low key things like, okay, I know no one's going to pay attention, but we'll put them out there.
People are paying attention. I paid attention. I saw it.
Yeah, I would say it probably took, though, a month or 2 months before I got into a groove. It's kind of interesting. You walk this thin line between being in a groove, making sure you're super comfortable, but not being so repetitive that it's not fun to listen to. Like, you do your opening on the show and it's the same sort of verbiage, and then, you get into it. But yeah, that's really how it came about. This marketing consultant said, you got to do it. I agreed with her, took a chance, and I really enjoy it. It honestly becomes one of the highlights of the things I do during the week. It's a creative outlet. I'm connecting with people of the industry who are like-minded. They like being on the show. Like, for example, I interviewed Mark Stevens, the editor of Canadian Plastics, and, and he did a piece on me in print and the digital version of the magazine. So, and, we're doing the same sort of thing. You were on my show, I'm on yours. And, we're making sure that the voice of plastics is heard in our own unique, special way and area.
Yeah, we do things very differently, and that's fine. That's great, actually. That's the diversity that we need of positive voices in this industry. And the one thing that I particularly appreciate from our conversations is you're not going to shy away from a difficult conversation either. I think that's important. If we are going to be taken seriously by anybody that is outside of our industry, we have to be honest about things, and we have to be direct, and we have to communicate our messages well. or we're getting nowhere. And I could not agree with you more on the fact that this becomes like a highlight of the week because I get to meet somebody new practically every week and I get to talk to people. I work from home. You're working from home, your office of one. It's nice to talk to people. And Teams is great, but when you're in a Teams call and it's business related, it's always serving a function within the business. So you don't really get to know that person in the same way that you would having these kind of conversations, right? And I absolutely love getting to know people, hearing different opinions, and I'm sure it's the same for you. It's been a blast.
My original intent was to get suppliers and customers on. Probably right now it's been more suppliers. I've had some customers express interest, but those are interesting conversations because I would be exposing a commercial relationship that I have and creating potential for competitors. Yeah. So sure about that.
I can understand being a little squeamish about that. Yeah.
But to get a supplier come on and basically we're doing kind of like it's almost like an advertorial, or it is, but we're talking and you're hearing a guy and another guy and a gal, whatever, just talk about the products and have an open conversation about it. And if someone asks about that product, hey, I could send them a link. It's such, look, this is everything you're going to learn. This is it. So, back before YouTube and podcasts, we would call it a silent salesman letter. This is the glorified version of it. And, YouTube, it's so amazing. It really is the democratization of broadcasting, and it's so powerful.
Just loving every second of it. We talked a little bit around this. How do you feel that we can truly change hearts and minds of the typical consumer? How do we get to your neighbor and convince them that plastics are not necessarily the devil?
There's been so much attention on things like microplastics, and it's just getting a lot of visibility. It's not all bad that that's happening, because the first thing is people have to understand that no matter what they consume, there's a consequence.
Exactly.
So there has to be sort of a raised level of mindfulness on how consumers conduct themselves. And if plastics kind of takes the brunt of that initially, I can live with that if people kind of start understanding that, well, okay, there's rubber, there's glass, there's steel, there's cement or concrete. What do you do with that? It's essentially a thermoset style material, one and done. How do you reprocess that? It's not so easy. Getting people to understand that plastics in many cases are the best alternatives, but being able to back it up quickly, that 30-second elevator pitch kind of, and talking about, the carbon footprint of the material, how easy it is to make from wellhead to pellet, how little energy is involved compared to, well, you want to make something out of glass, you've got to get a blast furnace going and heat this thing up to whatever degrees. Steel, thousands of degrees. Well, where do you think the energy comes from that? Having those kind of conversations and getting people to think. And then, debunking some of the inaccurate things around microplastics. I recently said, I think it was to my cousin, she had sent me some article about black plastic. And was this dangerous?
Your relatives do the same thing? Yeah, mine do that. It gets frustrating after a while, right? Every negative plastics article comes your way.
It is frustrating, but on the other hand, here's the at-bat to actually get the truth out there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if there were 100 things that were going to kill you, plastics is like 250 of them.
Yeah.
You really want to take control of your health and well-being. Don't eat ultra-processed foods, or cut them out. Cut out excess sugar, like a lot of flour and starch, and minimize your alcohol consumption. Don't worry about plastics. They're not going to do you in.
On the episode that's actually airing right now, it published about 50 minutes ago. We talked a little bit about microplastics on there, and I was very clear that I don't know enough about microplastics to, let's say, make it a topic for a full episode on here. But everything that I know about it is it's not conclusively linked to any kind of negative impacts in the human body. And I said that if it ever changes and there is research that happens that says otherwise, I am going to have that conversation. I don't care if it makes everybody in the plastics industry angry. We're going to talk about that. And It's just the way it is.
Absolutely. And if there is a link, it probably wouldn't be every single thing. Might be, one resin family. Like, okay, well, let's deal with that and understand what the actual problem is and formulate a path forward for that particular problem. But, when I had Dr. Christy Armit on my show in the beginning of December, we talked a lot about microplastics, and the original study that sort of raised the red flag on warning people about microplastics, it was eventually pulled. It was rescinded because the mathematics were done incorrectly. And I think it amplified the threat 1,000,000 times or something. And
sounds like the black plastics thing. It's
Yeah.
like the same situation.
the thing about that drives me crazy, you expect maybe one incidence of one factory somewhere that would take plastics containing an FRM.
Yeah.
And they would use it in a food contact application. That's not our standards here in North America, far from it. Like, we're very careful, and it comes to don't oversell the material. But because we've got the FDA and in Canada pretty well follow suit. We've got our own board that approves these things, but we follow suit to FDA standards. If you have a food contact application, you have to have FDA compliant or approved materials.
And not just the materials, every ingredient in the plastic has to be approved by the FDA. So all this garbage, my best friends at Beyond Plastics saying that thousands of toxic chemicals are going into food contact applications, just patently false. Are some of these chemicals toxic when they're in gaseous forms and things like that? Yeah. But once you polymerize it, it is inert, it is safe, it is FDA approved. So it's just a bunch of fear mongering, and it really bothers me.
Because it's FUD marketing, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's how you get headlines, sell papers, get clicks.
Make money. That's how Michael Bloomberg funds Beyond Plastics, and then they get even more and more and more money. I saw they did a funding drive the other day claiming to be poor. And the amount of money that Bloomberg put into that, it's insane for anybody to give them money. They have more money than God. You do not need to give them money. It's insane. And anyway, once again, we are off topic. Me getting angry at Judith Hank, and she's nowhere near me. But that's really all the stuff I wanted to cover. I always like to give anybody that comes on this show an opportunity to discuss a topic that we haven't covered today, anything that's close to your heart. So you're burning on today that you wanted to cover?
To anybody who's listening that is a plastics processor, if you own a molding company, an extrusion company, whatever the case, or you're in procurement for a company like that, give the little guy a chance. We might surprise you with what we can do. We've chosen this path because we kind of want to do things on our own, and we can find certain things, bring a lot of value to the table. Just give us a chance.
You got a lot of agility because you got no overlords. You can do what you want, which is always nice. So what's the easiest way for people to get in touch with you? I'll put in the show notes a link to your website and then your LinkedIn, and then I'll put on there your show website so people can find you that way. But what's the easiest way for them to get into touch with you?
So probably email info@simcoeplastics.com.
And that's with an E.
Yes.
Simcoe with an E.
SIMCOE plastics with an S.com.
There you go. For those people that are too lazy to read the show notes. Now they know. Kurt, I'm going to tell you again, I really love what you're doing. Please keep doing it. I know you're enjoying it. I enjoy the heck out of doing this. And we need more people in the industry that are just willing to have open conversations. If we want to be taken seriously, we have to have open conversations with all parties. So my next episode after you is going to be with composting company. And then the one after that's going to be another composter. And I've been working, Dane Stagles, if you listen to this, we've been talking now since November about getting you on the show. We got to get a date and we got to talk plastics. And it's not even a debate. It's just a discussion. And I'm going to let you say whatever you want about plastics. But anyway, with all of that being said, This is the Redefining Plastics podcast. Thanks to my guest, that plastics guy, Kurt Stahle. Really appreciate you being on. And everybody that's listening, have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin.
If you want to learn more about the plastics industry, recycling, check out these other videos. Please like and subscribe.